Welcome to the Phase Space Invaders podcast, where we explore the future of computational biology and biophysics by interviewing researchers working on exciting, transformative ideas. Today I'm talking to Aleksei Aksimentiev, a group leader at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, whose work is focused on exploring the interface of physics, biology, and nanotechnology. The most prominent line of his research is the study of nanopores, both protein and solid state, in which the sequence of a biomolecule can be inferred from experimentally measurable ion currents during translocation. However, his group has also been pioneering the use of molecular simulations in the study of large-scale nucleic acid assemblies, from DNA origami to genome packaging in a viral capsid. So Aleksei brings up many great background stories of how these devices came to life, how most of his projects were born out of his openness to explore new scientific territories, and how he ended up in Klaus Schulten's lab in Illinois in the first place. He makes a great case for embracing uncertainty and ambitious goals, but then we also discuss the role of mentoring in this process, and how a great mentor can imbue us with a sense of wonder and direction that will put us on a path to great scientific contributions. As a side note, inspired by our off-record chat about Aleksei's family back in Ukraine, that's just my reminder to reach out to your colleagues who have family and personal lives, not only in Ukraine, but zones of war and human rights abuses in general. I know this is a sensitive and complex topic, so I won't share any generally applicable words of wisdom, but support, listening, understanding, and giving space are often the least we can do. With that being said, hope you liked today's conversation. Let's go. Aleksei Aksimentiev, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
So, Aleksei, I got to know your scientific profile as part of the extended Schulten family at Urbana-Champaign, a place that has been a powerhouse for computational biophysics for, at least 3 decades now. But you find your happy spot closer to nanobiotechnology or the practical application of biological structures to problems like nanopore sequencing or DNA packaging. And only recently, I realized you initially moved from studying particle physics in Kyiv to the PhD in material science in the lab of Robert Hołys in Warsaw. And do you see your research path as a natural consequence of those early choices, of this early background, or was there some serendipity involved?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, actually, to start. I always like to tell the story. So, yeah, I grew up in Ukraine. I was always interested in how things, what things are made of. Both of my parents were scientists. I went into first chemistry, and when I was 6th grade, I thought, well, if I know how elements are arranging themselves into compounds, I'll know something about the world. But then I got to read the college textbook. I just happened to have it. And then the preface was about particles. They're particles, like electrons and protons. And then I realized I have to go to physics because that was my interest. So I entered Ivan Franko National University in Ukraine, which is in Lviv. And there I got my master's degree with specialty in particle physics. And that was in 96. So the Soviet Union already collapsed. And we had an exceptionally strong class. Like from the whole 200 people, they selected out 10 and put them in one class in theory physics. So, of course, I wanted to do science, right? So I wanted to go and do a PhD. And looking back at my scientific path, I think the best thing that happened to me, I didn't get into a grad school in Ukraine. Yeah, that was probably the pivotal moment because, we had only 4 spots, and there were like 8 of us or wanted to do it. Yeah, and then somehow there was this other person who used to go to Poland for work. And he said, hey, well, there's this opportunity. Maybe you go do a PhD in Warsaw. I'm like, well, okay, all right. And so I was not involved in the communication with my future PhD advisor, but they thought I really wanted to do something particle physics-like. But the lab where I went was soft matter physics. So somehow they thought that, well, okay, so here's a project for you. Let's do field theory for polymers. That's where you have this one loop approximations, cumulant expansions. Before Mathematica was super messy and complicated. But that's how I ended up with a topic for my PhD, which was purely theoretical, lots of integrals and stuff. Yeah, that was total luck. Yeah. I mean, what was maybe not luck is my decision to be open, like where to go. So I said, well, great. So let's just see what Poland is like. It also helps that I knew Polish already back then. I've never spoken a word of Polish, but I knew it because back in Soviet Union, we watched Polish TV. It's near the border. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And everything people could say on TV, I understood perfectly. Yeah, and after that, it was completely also another random thing that happened. I was quick with my PhD, which I attribute to my advisor, Robert Hollis. So he was extremely good at realizing someone's ambition. So I unexpectedly graduated in 2.5 years, and before I was considering applying for a postdoc position, another event happened. So it happened that a person from Mitsui Chemicals was visiting Warsaw, and somehow we start talking, and then it turns out that they so happen have a postdoc position in my field of expertise, which is field theory for polymers, in a chemical company in Japan. Right? That's like coincidence. I don't know. Later on, I learned that there was a reason for it. But anyway, and so I actually never applied for my first postdoc. It's just, it found me.
I see.
So again, total coincidence. But again, I was open to learning new culture. It was interesting to go to Japan and see what it is like. What I guess was different was that it was in a company, not in a university. So I didn't know what it would be. And it was very educational, and it gave me also perspective on how things work in industry. Because in my experience, industry is industry everywhere you go. So it's not just Japanese.
Right, that's great, because we have a lot of talk of going back and forth between academia and industry.
Yeah.
It's always good to hear examples of successful transfers back and forth, that it's not just a one-way street.
Successful transfer. It's interesting. I think it's successful. I mean, in my first postdoc, I was doing simulation. That was my first simulation work, actually. We looked at phase separation in polymer mixtures, which is an interesting subject in soft matter physics, critical phenomena, and so on. It was interesting, great stuff, soft matter. I love it. But it was actually Robert, my PhD advisor, who convinced me. Not convinced me. He ignited my interest in biology. He told me, Alec, biology is the future. There's so many interesting things there. And he was inspirational. So I was convinced, okay, let's do biology. Problem is, I didn't even know the difference between like proteins and DNA. Nevertheless, I Googled biophysics, and it's a true story. I Googled biophysics. Klaus Schulten's lab was the first hit.
That was what, 2003, 2004?
2001. 2001. It was just when, well, it was end of 2000, really. And that was Google.
One of the first Googles.
One of the first, but Klaus's website was so incredible, powerful, because when I joined here as a postdoc, I had my, of course, site, my entry. And if I were to Google my first name, which is a fairly common name, I would be top 5 hits, He just had this really big cloud in the Google
big boost, yeah.
But anyway, but that's a true story. I Googled biophysics and ended up in Urbana. I never heard of it before.
That's cool. That's definitely serendipity. Yeah. In this way.
Well, I would say there was a serendipity and choices, right? I knew I didn't want to do. I mean, the phase separation is interesting, and now there is renewed interest with its application to biological condensate. So it is an interesting field. I just didn't feel I want to do it for the rest of my life. And when when you're going from one postdoc to another and you have a reasonable resume, that's your opportunity to change the field, which I took,
Yeah.
and I never regretted that I did.
I think we very often fall in love with particle physics, right? Whatever takes us there. But then we almost universally realize we're not going to be professional particle physicists. I think I had, as a teenager, perhaps I went through the same phase at some point. You were much more serious in that approach, of course,
but it's also my, as I grew, became adult, my perception of what is interesting to me changed as well. My decision to switch to biology, biophysics was driven by the same question. I was still interested in what it is that make things around us the way they are. It's just I was no longer interested in abstract, atoms. I was interested in living things.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, what about your current theme of research, which is nanobiotechnology?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not just like nanobiotechnology. We are fairly open to everything that has a biomolecular component. So we do classical biophysics problem as well, like viruses, organelles, and so on. But I guess my lab specialty is modeling the interface between biological and man-made systems very broadly. I would say it holds a lot of potential for future, like real-life applications, because, in the field of biomolecular modeling, typical questions are, how does enzyme A work, and so on. Sometimes it's a collection of enzyme. Now with new computer system, we can do larger system and so on. We can ask questions of higher biological relevance, right? But still, we are still kind of far from actually saying, and the cell will die and the cell will live, So there's still a little bit of disconnect between the molecular scale and what actually happens at the cell scale. And that is, of course, something that we want to bridge over the next 20 years. But in the field of this bio-nanotechnology or nanobiotechnology, the scale is confined. So you are looking at the right scale, which is the scale of individual molecules, maybe collection of molecules, and the scale of nanoscale devices that are built. So with instruments and technology that we have, computation technology, we can model the relevant system, so to say, to scale. And the results that we get usually can be, usually maybe too strong word, but can be compared to experiment, in some cases 1-to-1. And it's also easier to make predictions that can be tested and vice versa. You can use simulations to interpret results of experiments.
All right, so perhaps more limited by your own creativity and less by the complexity of the system, as you would say.
I should say, since this is kind of an open conversation, I must say that my path to that was also a little bit interesting. Okay, so I came to Klaus Schulten's lab, and I was really, my God, I was so happy. Finally, my first project was working on FOF1 ATP synthase. The enzyme that makes ATP in our body. And as I said, that's an attribute to me being complete newbie. I didn't realize how difficult the project was. I was like, of course, let's do it. And somewhere in the month 9, I realized we don't have a structure for the FO part, and what we were doing is a model and so on. Yeah. Well, anyway, so it was probably one of the most difficult projects that I've done as a postdoc. But don't get me wrong, I loved it. But I got one publication out of it in 2 years, and it was really difficult. I'm proud of it, but it was super difficult.
I get it, because we jumped on the same project 10 years later, and we're still working on the F1 FO.
It's very difficult. Well, now at least there are structures, right? And now at least there are structures, right? And before it was model, and I didn't realize, because I was newbie, that's the difference between model and structure is how much people will believe what happens after, right? Well, anyway, so Klaus's lab was in Beckman Institute, which is an interdisciplinary place. So you have people doing psychology, brain scans, material science, like autonomous vehicle, all kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And on the same floor, there was a person who was a former Bell's Lab member, so he moved here. So he was into like extreme nanotechnology. So his name was Greg Timp. So he has influenced my trajectory tremendously. It's, again, maybe it's serendipity or not, but he was super energetic, organized this weekly or bi-weekly seminars where he would invite people from campus and they would discuss crazy projects. Like making a tiny device out of silicon to put in bloodstream, that you would power up with radio waves. And one of the questions was, okay, so let's say we make it, so what is it gonna do, right? And the idea was, well, we're gonna use it to sense things, and that's when this nanopore sequencing came about. The idea was, so we'll drill a hole through a gate of a transistor. That was his spiel, and we'll sense whatever there is about cells and so on. I was really excited by his vision, and I really liked to work on that project. And so it happened. Klaus just got a grant on that, and I said, I want to do it. Let me do it. And I did it. So, it was cool. I was really driven by it. It was interesting. No one has done anything like that before. Had to adapt biomolecular force fields to silicon nitride. And we learned a lot, since we did this first simulation. And I was, in a way, fortunate because of the environment in which I was doing it. So we had developers of NAMD and VMD, next door. Because we didn't know if it would ever work, No one simulated infinite crystal of silicon nitride in NAMD, and it just worked. There were a few things that Jim Phillips, an NAMD developer, implemented to make it happen later on. We also ended up developing this electrostatic analysis for VMD. It was really helpful to have access to developers on site. But I guess the programs were well written, so most of the time it just worked.
And now it's something that exists out there, right? I mean, the nanopore sequencing.
Nanopore
sequencing. Already the application? Was it something that you had in mind at the time, or?
So nanopore sequencing, of course, it now is a legend in a sense. So one can look back to a moment in time when Dave Deamer and Dave Brenton, they were driving along Highway 1 or something like that, and Dave Deamer had this idea, if a DNA going through nanopore, you read the sequence by measuring current. So that is a documented fact. So you can actually trace back this to 1987. The first published work was done by John Kasyanovich, who is a pioneer in the field. So he actually showed that the nanopore sequencing is possible by experimentally moving a strand of DNA or RNA molecules through a membrane channel called alpha hemolyse. So the idea of nanopore sequencing is that one reads the sequence, let's say DNA, by measuring ionic current that flows through a pore. If the dimensions of the pore are of the same size as the dimensions of the nucleotide, you could expect to see differences in the ionic current as the DNA is passing through it. So that was basically the idea. Whether or not it would work back then wasn't clear, but John Kasyanovich's experiment shows that one can actually do experiments, and indeed DNA goes through it, and you can actually tell homopolymers apart. So that was 96, and that kind of jump-started the field. Also, there were other works in the area that predated that, like from Sergei Bezrukov, where they sense molecular events using nanopores, basically. It's single molecule sensing, but it was not sequencing. So that was the idea. Now, would it work or not? That's a good question. When I heard of it, I was very excited. I had no doubt that it would work, honestly, because I didn't see, maybe because I work with atoms all the time, I didn't see a reason why it would not work, But that's also maybe a bias of a theorist, because as an experimentalist, and now that I know a lot about experiment, I can also see many reasons why it would not work. But
that's true. I often ask experimentalists, why shouldn't this work? And they always have good reasons.
No, but the key was actually having a stable pore. This is something that doesn't come to mind as a simulator, but in reality, all of those pores are gate. They open and close stochastically, and that really doesn't help sequence DNA if it happens. And kudos to John Kasyanovich and his co-workers that they did it, because that was done without knowing the structure of the channel. You realize the structure was shown later.
That is hard.
Yeah, so I had no doubt that it would work, but Greg Tim convinced me that, all those biological pores, it's rubbish. The key, we're going to do it with the solid state pores, right? Because we know how to put billion transistors on a chip, and so we can have billions nanopores on a chip and do sequencing. So in a way, this is really transformative and cool idea, and I was sold on it. By the way, it's still not done, but there are issues when you put semiconductors into water. Yeah, so we know how to do like really tiny lithography with synthetic materials in vacuum. Once you put it in such salty waters, then, things grow, dissolve, and there are also dielectric capacitance that you don't think of if you're used to working with air and so on. So there are many reasons it won't work, but I think it can be done in the long term.
That's why we need physicists still, yeah.
Yeah, that was, I really liked that project. Yeah.
Do you think you're at the stage where you can drive, let's say, technological progress with simulations, with ideas these days? Or is it still kind of more in the explanatory or data fitting phase?
No, absolutely. I especially in this field of bio-nano, we are not data fitting, for sure. With the current state of molecular dynamics a lot, and we can get the currents reliably for structures that we know their structure, right? Of course, if we don't know their structures and we don't know their chemical composition, then it's an order of magnitude kind of result. But if it's truly a biological channel, then we should be able to get the current right. And if we don't, that usually means our interpretation of experiment is wrong. But that's right. Kind of what I learned. It could be that the protein is misfolded or something else is there. We are at that stage that we expect to get the number right. And if we don't, then probably something wrong with the underlying assumption.
Okay.
But to answer your question directly, if we can drive the technology development, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So coming back to this nanopore sequencing. So the problem with conventional nanopore sequencing was that the electric field was used to do two things: to pull the DNA through and to move ions through the pore. So the faster you pull the DNA, the more current you get the higher signal, but the less time the DNA spends in the pore, so you actually get a shorter read. So that doesn't help. And the other way around, if you apply lower bias, you can capture DNA, but even if you capture, then your ionic current is low. So around 2008, Jens Gundlach and his lab, they came up with a new pore, which shape was just perfect for DNA sequencing. It has this very narrow constriction. And then Mark Akinson from UC Santa Cruz, so he was developing enzymes to independently control the speed of transport. So you combine those two and you have nanopore sequencing working, right? So So that kind of worked and was realized experimentally back in 2012. But the point I was trying to make is that before this enzyme, was invented to do, we also tried to engineer a nanopore surface so that it would bind DNA stronger, so it would kind of naturally slow it down, right? And I was at that point was thinking to myself, but also to my students and postdoc, saying, if you, say, you go to sleep and you wake up with a sequence, that does it, well, then you're a billionaire, in a way. I mean, seriously, because it's very transformative. The time it goes from, this is a sequence that will work, to the point that you actually implement it in practice, probably a few months, and then, of course, you write disclosures and all of those things. It was a very short kind of time frame from idea to real-life impact, which I liked a lot. So well, we didn't come up with a design, but we are working, actually, it's one of the areas of research for us, to design custom pores for detection of custom modifications on DNA and RNA, and of course, protein sequencing. So nanopore sequencing is done now. It was commercialized by Oxford Nanopore Technologies, I guess, disclosure. So I'm working with them. So I guess I have to say it. But yeah, they have a device you can buy and it works. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of work going into detection of modifications, right? Because this is such a hard thing to study with all the other setups, all the other experimental techniques, that perhaps a direct detection is the only way to get good quantification and good placement. And
yeah, well, nanopore sequencing
thing.
is kind of the only method that actually reads the native DNA, because usually you do some kind of amplifications, use the product of it. Yeah. Well, mass spec, I mean, if you can do single molecule mass spec, that would be another way to do it, but we are very far from that happening. But for the nanopore, the next frontier is protein sequencing. There's a lot of interest in protein sequencing, especially detection of all of the PTM. So there, the number of modifications is, well, it's not astronomical, but it's huge. And we want to do it at a single molecule level, and there's simply no technology to do it. With nanopore sequencing of DNA, by the time nanopore sequencing of DNA started, we already had technology. We always tricked nature to do it for us, like feeding it with fluorophore that it cannot digest and so on. And nanopore sequencing was physical method. We would read it by physical means. But because there were already existing technology, it was up to market to determine which technology would actually work. And that is something that is outside the realm of science, as you understand.
Yeah. Non-scientific forces at play.
But with protein sequencing, there aren't really that many. Well, right now there are a few companies that have alternative methods for protein sequencing, but it's nowhere near being done. So we'll see what will happen.
Right. I can see the appeal of having a technique that will give you the right statistics of each modification, right? When you can combine with pull-down assays, you can select for things that are bound to DNA or bound to a specific fraction of DNA.
Yeah, the other area where we're active are so-called DNA nanotechnology. So that's where we use DNA as a building material. And I'll go back to Ned Seaman and his invention of DNA nanotechnology the way we know it. Paul Rosenmoon inventing DNA origami and so on. So that was also a field that I was looking at since the beginning. It is cool, has this huge cool appeal, which is why it ends up covers of Science and Nature. But there wasn't anything for us to do there. That's also, if someone thinks, when do you enter the field? There should be a reason to enter the field. And our reason was my friend and collaborator, Ulrich Kaiser, so he wanted to make nanopores out of DNA. Mm-hmm. So that's actually how we got into it. So nanopores out of DNA, so the appeal is that you can make them of any size, and it's DNA, so it's biocompatible, you have good control. And so Sanjay Jung Yu was a postdoc in my lab, and he was incredible. And I said, well, why don't we do this? And he's like, well, yeah, but maybe first we do origami. I'm like, okay. 24 hours later, okay, so here it's running. It's like, what?
Great to have those people in the lab.
No, he's incredible. And so that's how we did this first all-atom simulation of DNA origami, just because it was there. So in a way, it was like climbing Mount Everest. Of course, we learned something about it, but our drive was to say that we can do it. But once we had the technology to do all-atom simulations of systems, of course, we start exploring and making testable predictions, right? So that is also one of the areas where I can pinpoint to instances where we discovered something just by looking at all-atom MD simulations. So, for example, we were interested in those DNA nanopores, right? So DNA nanopores, you make, it's like a membrane channel, but made of DNA. Of course, DNA is charged, so it doesn't want to go into the membrane. So to make it go into the membrane, you decorate DNA with something hydrophobic. So there's like a ring of hydrophobic moieties that wants to insert into the bilayer. And if conditions are right, then the insertion happens and the DNA goes in. So we were looking at that just to see how much current actually is leaking through the walls, because DNA is not super compact. You would assume that some of the ionic current would flow along the walls of the DNA, and indeed, we did see that. Well, okay, so that was nice. We had this result, and we were writing up 2 papers with Kaiser's lab. And then I was at a meeting in Telluride. So my name is Aksimentiev, and the person who organizes the meeting, he had this very ingenious way of organizing talks, just alphabetically. There was only one person before me. His name was, I will mispronounce, but it was AC. So he was right before me, and he was talking about biological scramblases. So scramblases are the enzymes that scramble lipid composition. I maybe have heard of them before. I mean, I of course heard of flipase and flopase, but those are active ones. But passive ones, I was looking at his talk and I was like, I think we've made a scramblase out of DNA origami because, once you place it in, you fuse the two leaflets. And
yes.
And I wrote an email to my student who was then in the lab. I said, well, can you actually see lipids go from one side to the other? Of course, and they did.
Absolutely.
But then what happened? We of course sent this result to Ulrich Kaiser, and his student actually spent 2 years measuring it, experiment. This is not an easy experiment, especially if you're not doing this for a living. No, that was a learning process for him and for the lab. Because then once they know how to do it, they did it multiple times. But so I really grateful to him and Kaiser Lab, so they invested so much time into actually showing that this happens experimentally. And I think we had a nice paper out of it with multiple possibilities potentially for using it for all kind of medical application.
It's good to be on the lookout for alternative usages of something that doesn't work as intended.
No, but this is an example where you actually see something in a simulation and you say you're making prediction.
Okay, so to switch gears, you wanted to mention the topic of mentoring in academia. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So mentoring, of course, is essential and frequently underappreciated part of academic life. As you go through ranks from undergrad students to professor, you switch roles from being a mentee to being a mentor. And through my own experience, I can attest that probably was one of the most essential parts of my career path and my success. During my undergrad, I probably can say that I didn't get much mentoring. It was kind of ad hoc, and it was also a style of Soviet education. You had courses, and that's it, right? If you do well, fine. But everything changed when I moved to Poland, and my PhD advisor Robert Hollis, he was a fantastic mentor. I wish I could be like him. He had this ability to ignite interest in people in their work. And just work, but kind of broader, doing science. It's so fun, and so on. But it is a personality thing. I don't think it's so easy to replicate. That's why some mentors are better than the others. But to me, it was essential. I got interested in actually pursuing a career in science because of him.
Yeah, I see. I have to say, I think the best quality I appreciate in mentors, and that's my personal thing, I don't know if it generalizes, but it's people who can say, maybe we fail in a spectacular way, but it will be a lot of fun to do it. And this kind of approach that, it's a lot of work, it doesn't always work out, but it's a tremendous fun to try new things and break things.
Yeah.
It's somehow inspiring. I agree with that.
That's right. And, mentoring now is popular. I don't know how it is in Europe, but in US, mentoring is one of the things that grant agencies require you to have. And I think it's a good thing because very frequently nobody pays any attention to it, right?
Yeah, it can be a failure mode in academia.
Right. Yeah. On the other hand, there is a tendency to institutionalize mentoring, and I see nothing wrong with it. I think it's good to have seminars and talks and manuals on how to mentor. But of course, there's a degree to which it can go. At the end of the day, mentoring is a psychology exercise between a mentor and a mentee. And the success of it, of course, depends on both parties involved. But that's my personal take. So that's how I think about it. I learned a lot from my mentors about, what actually going on, how the referee process works, right? Because mentors, they've been on both sides multiple times, especially if you have a mentor who is also an editor of a journal. So, that's even a third perspective. This is something you're not going to read somewhere. And some things, of course, are said in confidence, but that is insight to how the process works is incredible. And if you are a student and serious about a successful career in academia, ask your mentor about it. It will really, really help you a lot. Yeah,
I agree. I also agree it requires curiosity on the side of the student, right? To be open to this. Oh, please share with me the technicalities.
No,
because they can be boring to death, but
it's not like that. You just it's like one thing that I learned from Klaus Schulten, who was a great mentor as well, was so he always said, all these referees, and it goes to publication and specifically in particular grant applications, it's psychology. I mean, of course, it has to be great science, and that's true, but that's given, right? There are so many great sciences, but at the end of the day, it's just psychological exercise because you're convincing someone, and that someone is not a robot as a person.
Yeah.
That's kind of insight. I don't know if I would ever actually come up with by myself, maybe later on, but knowing it early on was really helpful.
That's a very good insight. Yeah.
Yeah, but mentorship, it goes both ways. I don't think there are too many mentors who would refuse a meeting with a mentee. It's our job. It's our job to give advice and counsel people. On the other hand, we can't chase students and enforce mentoring.
Yes,
that's also not good.
The dynamics has to be kind of.
It has to be. It goes both ways. And generally, I think everyone wants to see their students succeed, students postdocs succeed, because the success of students and postdocs, that's probably the biggest accomplishment for a mentor.
Yeah, that's what we eventually take pride in.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, Aleksei Aksimentiev, thank you for the great conversation and sharing your insights.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode of Face Space Invaders.